Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our study of Ayn Rand's Anthem. We're going to be addressing this, well, what do we call it? I mean, you could call it a novel. Some have called it a novella. I like what Ayn Rand called it. She called it a poem, and I like for us to approach our study of Anthem in this way. We'll study it as a myth, and I think that's important for your notes right away. Now, without question, Ayn Rand is one of the most controversial writers that we will study in 303. We'll look in our freshman year at Anthem, and then in our junior and senior years we'll study her Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. It's fascinating that I would mention those last two titles. At the end of the 20th century, I mean, I'll just give you guys an example of the ways in which Ayn Rand is controversial. At the end of the 20th century, there was a number of lists made of the most important novels of the 20th century. In any number of lists. There were several major lists made. One by groups of academics, professionals, professional readers, librarians, the like. And then there was a second list made of just normal readers, as it was sometimes referenced. I mean, you can Google this stuff and run down these lists. It was fascinating where Ayn Rand's work landed on these two lists. In the top 100 novels lists made by the great academics, none of Ayn Rand's work was there. In the other list, made by quote-unquote normal readers, number one novel on that list was a work of Ayn Rand's, Atlas Shrugged. And I think Fountainhead was also on that list. Now, that is fascinating to us, and the questions are obviously political in nature, they're obviously literary in nature. For our purposes, we simply want to take a look and study Rand as philosopher and as writer. As philosopher, her philosophic system is known as objectivism. We'll have something to say about that. As a writer, she's not only a novelist, she's also an essayist, and a polemic writer, some will argue as well. I mean, there's no question, she definitely has an axe to grind, and she's going to share what she has to say. Some people have faulted her as a novelist for this, that novelists should show, not tell, and that Ayn Rand fundamentally writes her novels to tell. I think that's a pretty sophomoric interpretation and reading of any book that would receive the kind of response that often readers of Ayn Rand's work will have. If you just go out and start asking people, do you know anything about Ayn Rand? It's fascinating the number of people that will say, dude, reading her changed my life. Anytime somebody tells me that, I'm always fascinated to know exactly what was going on and why. Now, there are some assumptions that we always address as we work anything through LearnStrong.net lectures. One of those is our learning theory, that desire not to like or dislike a work. No. There's too much about Ayn Rand that just begins and ends there. Oh, I really hate her stuff. It's like, come on. We're not looking to like or dislike. We're looking to learn through the art and the respect given that we will call appreciate a work, right? That desire to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways. Also, we assume that we're working with our three levels of reading. Level 1, what does the text say? Summary. Level 2, what does the text mean? 2A, themes, messages. 2B, the rhetorical level of writing. And here we're always concentrating on at least symbolism and irony. We'll see quite a bit of both in this text, Anthem. And then finally, the third question, how can I relate to this text in some meaningful way? And at 3A, how can I relate to other titles? And here we're later going to define this novel in that whole family of dystopian novelists. And we'll talk some about why that's so important. And then finally at 3B, we'll ask, how can I relate personally to this information? And it's here that we can begin to form an opinion, but let's form an opinion that's informed, if you get my drift. That is to say, let's actually see what this novella or this poem, as Ayn Rand called it a poem, let's see what it has to say. Brief biography and biographic information, because you really need to know this about Ayn Rand if you're going to appreciate what she wrote, okay? In any way, going to appreciate what she wrote. The first thing we got to say about her is that she was born in Russia, in St. Petersburg, 2nd of February 1905. So right at the beginning of the 20th century she's born. She grows up for her adolescent years in Russia, observing both the Russian Civil War and, in 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution. And for this reason, she hates the communists. They come in, they take away her father's pharmacy, and her loathing of all things communist and socialists will begin here. She lived in a certain kind of socialistic experiment, if we can call it that, and she learned to loathe it for any number of reasons, many of which are made clear in her writings. She ends up at the University of Petrograd, and there she studies philosophy and history. So she is, put it in your notes, some don't like to admit this, but she does have an academic background, okay? So she has studied Immanuel Kant, who she loathed, and a few other important philosophers as well. The big thing, though, is 1926. In February of 1926, she found her way to New York, and then later out west to Hollywood. She meets Cecil B. DeMille. She ends up getting involved. I mean, if you really want to find out more about her, there's documentaries made about her on I think Netflix or elsewhere. You can find that. You can look online. But the big thing that we want to point out is that she learns how to become a writer through learning to write screenplays, and I think that's important because she saw fiction as a conduit for the powerful scenic word picture creations that will become fundamental to the study of her novels. And here, of course, we're messing around with just Anthem. She ends up falling in love and marrying Frank O'Connor in 1929, and then for the rest of her life, for some 50 years, she stays married to him. In 1937, she writes Anthem. It's published in 1938 in the United Kingdom, not in America. In 1943, she publishes Fountainhead, and it's after Fountainhead that then Anthem starts to become a red commodity in the United States. And then in 1957, her tour de force, Atlas Shrugged, is published. Well, I'm going to have more to say about Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged in other lectures and when you're for my senior students later. She dies March 6, 1982 at the age of 77, and lives by the end of her life, she was a spokesperson for this philosophic movement that she calls objectivism, and we'll have more to say about that in a bit. But the first thing we want to say about Anthem now is that this is a work of what we call dystopian, D-Y-S, as in not utopian, dystopian fiction. Now, this enterprise of dystopian fiction, I'll say three things about it. One, it begins in the Western enterprise with Plato and Plato's Republic. Go to learnstrong.net, find the AP folder, find my lectures on Plato, also the Harvard Classics folder, and I'll have more to say about Plato's Republic. But in Plato's Republic, he speculates on the possibility of an ideal state and what that might look like. And one of the waves of Book 5 of Plato's Republic, again, you can watch my lectures on this, is this notion of a communal kind of living that was kind of built on his understandings of Sparta at the time. That idea of an ideal state where everyone shares everything in common is attacked repeatedly in the 20th and now the 21st century for reasons that are self-evident. The communist revolutions of both China as well as the Soviet Union produced some really horrific types of situations, and people had to try to come to terms with the fact that these were Marxist revolutions that produced serious problems of their own, and people like Ayn Rand are going to write books to try to challenge the very idea of the dystopian, the idea of building a utopia through a dystopian kind of enterprise. Now, we've got several examples that you have to put in your notes, as we will call it in 3A. The most important, Huxley will write Brave New World, challenging the same concept, as will George Orwell. And Orwell's 1984 is the classic dystopian novel. We'll study it later in our academic career, as well as a text called Animal Farm, his critique of communism. And then, of course, there's all kinds of other books that are of this dystopian genreic form as well, this strain. Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale, some of you are familiar with that through shows. Susan Collins' The Hunger Games, as well as Lois Lowry, The Giver. All of these are titles that we are familiar with both by reading as well as by film. And then there's movies that will play this game. Of course, the most important of the late 20th century, the Matrix films, the Terminator films, all play this game of what it looks like at the end of the world, right? When machines have taken over, or humans have blown up the world, or some kind of tyrannical figures running the world. In 1984, it's Big Brother. And of course, all of these writers share in common a concern about the individual versus the collective. And this is, in fact, Ayn Rand's primary critique, and we'll see it in Anthem. It's a critique of a collective society where individual rights and the celebration of the individual are diminished. Let's just look at the novel itself really quickly, and again, as I said, Ayn Rand called it a poem, and it reads very much like a poem. I mean, the opening lines of this poem, it is a sin to write this. I mean, what a great first line. It's a sin to think words no others think and to put them down upon a paper no others are to see. It is base and evil. It's as if we were speaking alone to no ears but our own. The use of the collective pronoun we and our here will be one of the hallmarks of this novel. I've had students who say, reading this novel drives me nuts because there is no personal pronouns used in the novel to designate the narrator. Let's talk about it. Who is this narrator? Well, he lives in this collective society where to do or think anything on one's own is considered sin, as we just read. Absolutely forbidden to be alone, and obviously we read that he is alone. He's in an underground tunnel. What we would understand later will probably be some kind of a subway system. Probably we are in New York City. That's the sense of it, right? Writing secretly by candlelight, because that's the apex of their current technology. Now, right away, put this in your notes. We realize we are in a futuristic world, okay, where things have clearly gone sideways on a number of counts. Technologically, for example, the advancement is a candle, all right? I mean, this book's going to be about the discovery of electricity and the way in which it just blows our narrator's mind that he's discovered electricity, all right? So, what's going on? Well, three things. One, we've got no name other than Equality 7-2521. Now, through my lecture, I'm not going to read that out again and again. I'll just simply call him the narrator. Later, at the end of the novella, he'll be called Prometheus because he'll name himself that. The second thing we learn is that there's been this, long, long ago, this thing called the Great Rebirth. And we're not exactly sure what happened at that moment. Probably something cataclysmic, catastrophic, obviously political. And the invention of the great we. And now the collectivist society has been formed, and you have no individualism within this collectivist society. And in fact, as we said, this narrator can only really speak of himself as a we. He never refers to himself as an I because this is a word he does not know. Now, I realize this is, that's why we call this a myth, obviously. What do we say myths are? Stories to explain the unexplainable. How is it possible that one could live in a world without an identity, and language is going to play a chief role in all of this? And again, as we said, the candle is the one thing about which this community considers its apex of technological advancement. All right? We're told that in the world that our narrator lives in, everyone is told that the only reason, right, for to be alive at all is for the greater good of his or her fellow brothers and sisters. In other words, there's this notion of we're all one big happy family, put quotation marks around the word happy. It's more about being docile and obsequious, just following the rules, right? Everyone is equal in every way, which means each person has to be treated exactly the same in every way. Society then is rigidly controlled. Nobody has any opportunity to stand out, either as an individual or to think of himself or herself as somehow special, certainly not as an individual in any way, right? The problem, though, for our narrator is that all his life, we learn early on in the novel, he has been, in fact, quite different. From the time he was a child, and he couldn't help it. His size, physically, he's taller, he's brilliant, he's much smarter. And we find out that the teachers grew to resent this kind of intelligence right away. By the way, biographers have pointed out this was true of Ayn Rand. At the age of 6, she already had decided that she was going to be a writer someday. She was extremely precocious, very, very capable linguistically and as well compositionally, and she felt like probably in her own life that many people resented her, not only because she was not American but Russian, but she was a woman and she had a mind of her own and she spoke that mind of her own, right? In his youth work, we learn that the narrator cared primarily about science and the love of wisdom, the love of knowledge, wanted to know new things. When he grew up, he hoped that he could become part of a community and be a scholar. We have a council of vocations who will assign everyone, for those of you who have read The Giver, you know a little bit about this paradigm. The idea that you don't get to choose what it is occupationally you do later in your life. But instead of being assigned as a scholar, he's assigned as a street sweeper. And it's not something that he wants to do, but it's something that he has to do. And so he's lived his life out for many, many years as a street sweeper. But we're told that 2 years prior, there's a monumental moment when he comes across this grate in the middle of the street of the earth, and he climbs down in it with a pal of his and discovers an underground tunnel. We're talking probably an old subway that's been abandoned from many years prior. And he will decide this is where he will spend his alone time. And the way it works is, in the evenings they show a film, he can sneak out of the theater, he can go down into his alone space. We think of Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own in regards to the way that Ayn Rand constructs this. And I think to read Rand right, I think you do have to have in the back of your mind some of the work of Virginia Woolf. We have other lectures on LearnStrong.net in the senior folder about Virginia Woolf. And down there in the subway, well, what's he going to do? He's going to write, which is illegal. He's going to make scientific discoveries, which is illegal. And, of course, for that, there's going to be some serious problems, okay? That's the first movement of this poem. The second movement of this poem is our narrator and his love affair. Some have called this a really beautiful love story, and I think Ayn Rand herself felt that it was a beautiful love story on a number of counts. But he will meet equality 7-2521, and again, I'm just going to call this. He's going to meet a woman whose name is Liberty 5-3000, and I'm just going to call her the love interest of this novella, so I don't have to read this Liberty 5-3000 over and over again. He falls in love with this woman, which is against the rules, because we have a eugenics project where you're not allowed to meet and fall in love with the person you meet and fall in love with, but rather a communal experiment where everything is orchestrated in the terms of sexuality. Go back to our comments on Plato's Republic, Book 5, to hear more about the ancient instantiation of this idea. And of course, in the history of the world in the 20th century, we're all together familiar, tragically, with this idea of trying to, in some way, create a perfect society by bringing together intentionally humans the way one would maybe bring together intentionally fine horses or sheep or whatever, cows or whatever. Okay? The narrator passes this woman in the fields. He's sweeping the streets, and of course, you're not supposed to care about any single specific individual. And he, of course, the narrator is extremely excited about the potentiality he's going to meet her. He also mentions that he finds himself wandering a lot about this thing we'll call the unspeakable word. Now, ultimately, this will be the word I, the identification of the individual. This is a forgotten word. It's a word severely punished if ever used, right? We hear from the narrator a little bit later, the next movement of the poem, that he has discovered electricity. And in the process of discovering electricity, he can produce an electric light. He's obviously down in the subway, and he's seen light bulbs, and often the symbol of all symbols of Anthem is the light bulb for this reason. He wants to share his research with the council that will be meeting, called the World Council, soon in his own city, the greatest minds, if you will. And he feels that if he can just come to this council, he can apologize for the sin of being alone and of creating something by himself. But it's going to be so useful that surely everybody's going to forgive him for, the oversight. But he gets caught. And this is a pivotal moment. This will remind those of us who know Orwell's 1984. He gets caught, and he is brought in front of the authorities. In this case, the Palace of Corrective Detention. He's going to be beaten, he's going to be tortured, and he refuses to say what it is that he's been doing and why he's been out all by himself. You're never allowed to be alone in Anthem's world, right? For a month he stays in prison. What's fascinating is that as the World Council gets ready, of this World Council of scholars, as they get ready to arrive, he has to get out to inform them. And for those of you that know our study of Plato's Republic, Book 7, and the idea of the cave allegory and coming into the darkness of the cave from the outside to liberate, right, these messiah, these liberators, often what happens to them? Well, obviously, they're often crucified, shot. We think of Martin Luther King Jr., don't we? And the idea here is that he's going to break out of prison and he's going to find a way to share his brilliant insights of the electric light. He does it. And immediately he is stunned by how furious they are with him. They cannot as a group believe that he has done this. They have no interest in hearing what he has to say. Obviously, Rand is making some references here to Galileo and his meetings with that famous council where he just asked them, dude, would you just look through the can? That's all I'm asking you to do. We don't need to look through the can. We already know everything we need to know. And of course, Galileo had to recant his position, whispering on his way out that history would, of course, vindicate him as being right. Certainly, that's been the case. And then they're ready to execute him. They're going to torture him, execute him. And when he realizes it, then he has to make his flight, and that will be the end of our novel. He jumps out of a window. He makes his flight into the uncharted forest, and it will be in that uncharted forest where no one is allowed to go. And of course, this notion in these myths, and think about the way that this is so powerful. In these myths, the idea of going into the unknown, to follow into a place where people have told you you're not supposed to go. Into the forest he goes. In the forest, he has these moments of elucidation and enlightenment. He's blown away by the fact that now he is all by himself. Until he's not. She, the love interest, right, Liberty 5-3000, shows up. And she says, if I've got to die, I want to die with you. And so the two of them, of course, are extremely happy. They walk through the woods a long ways, and then they stumble onto a house. And in this house, they find all kinds of interesting things, especially books and a mirror. And we come back to an ancient myth of Narcissus and Milton's Paradise Lost with Eve as well. And the woman loves to look at herself in the mirror and see how beautiful that she is. The 11th chapter is the compelling chapter. It's really the important climax chapter, and I'm excited to share a few of these lines with you. After reading, the way the chapter opens, I am. I think, I will. My hands, my spirit, my sky, my forest, this earth of mine. And we can't help but enjoy our study of Walt Whitman and Song of